Hello and welcome to the new era of Lone Trader bike reviews. So what have I got for you here today? What I have is a 1998 Honda CBR 1100 XX Super Blackbird. Let's talk a little bit about the Blackbird and its history first. So all throughout the 1980s, the main focus of development for Japanese motorcycle manufacturers was top speed figures and power figures. This was something that continued through into the 90s, and in 1990, I believe it was, Kawasaki launched the ZZR 1100, which was a very similar bike to this actually, although a bit more crude. And that took the top spot as the fastest production motorcycle for the early part of the 90s. In 1996, Honda created the Super Blackbird, and basically its goal was to unseat the Kawasaki as the fastest production motorcycle, which it did. And it held that sort of crown until 1999, when Suzuki launched the Hayabusa, and that took over as the fastest production motorcycle. But despite all that, the Honda Super Blackbird basically stayed unchanged until it finished its production run in 2007, so it basically had an 11-year production run. I believe it might have stopped selling a bit earlier in the US, but it continued till 2007 in Europe. Although it remained largely unchanged, there were some small modifications that were made throughout the production run. In 1999, the fuel system switched from carburetors to fuel injection. And in 2001, I believe, the instrument cluster changed from analog clocks to digital clocks. But not much change. There wasn't really a raise in power or top speed with the switch to fuel injection. It was literally just to conform with emissions regulations. This one is a 1998, so it's one of the original carburetted models. So let's dive a little more into the specs of the Super Blackbird. It's approximately an 1100cc inline-4 engine. I believe it was actually an enlarged version of the engine in the CBR 900 Fireblade from a few years earlier. It puts out about 135 bhp at the wheel and about 78 to 80 foot-pounds torque at the wheel. So that's quite a lot of power for the time, but probably these days it's not considered particularly high-powered when you get some sports tourers that are putting out more than that quite easily. It's quite a conventional bike. There's not much on here that could be considered revolutionary at the time, with the exception of the brakes. It had linked brakes where if you squeeze the front lever, 2 pistons of the 3-piston calipers would operate on the front brake, and 1 piston of the 3-piston caliper on the rear brake would operate. And the reverse is true if you pressed the rear brake. So 2 pistons of the rear brake would operate, and 1 each of the pistons on the 3-piston calipers on the front would operate. And that's basically how it works. It's chain driven, and there is a 180 section rear tyre. The top speed, I believe, is about 178, 180 miles per hour. There are different figures depending on who you've seen testing it and at what time. I think that the carburetted model is supposed to be slightly faster in top speed than the fuel-injected model, but it's damn as near it makes no difference. The bike is about 250 kilos wet, so it's quite a heavy beast. It's conventional forks at the front, and it's a conventional shock at the back. So apart from the link brakes, there's not really a huge amount to make this bike stand out, apart from the fact that it was very fast for the time and is still relatively powerful considering. Anyway, enough talking about it. Let's get on the road. You might notice, compared to the normal reviews I do, this bike actually has the original silencers on, which is not normal for me, but I'll explain a bit later about that. The main impression I get when riding this bike, the feel of it, is that it's incredibly well screwed together. It's of an era when Honda was still very much at the top of its game and trying to prove itself as the best engineering firm in terms of motorcycles in the world. and you can really feel it with this. This was a flagship bike for Honda. Although it is a very heavy bike, one of the main features about riding it that I like is that all of the controls are very light to operate. So although you can feel that it's a heavy bike and it never feels like it completely loses its mass, you never have to put a huge amount of effort into controlling the bike. So to get it to turn in, it doesn't require much effort on the bars. To brake, the link brakes seem to ensure that there's not a huge amount of lever effort that needs to go on. The throttle is nice and light, the clutch is nice and light. Everything is quite easy to operate. And as a result, despite this being a large, touring, sporting, flagship type machine, getting out and about and just doing your everyday biking stuff and everyday chores is very easy on this bike. It feels just as at home bumbling around town as it does destroying A roads and touring for miles and miles on end. And to sort of demonstrate that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a little route for this review that takes me through the centre of town, takes me out onto the motorway, and then we'll do some B-road country riding before heading home. One of the other great feelings you get from this bike is an incredible feeling of smoothness. I've not ridden a fuel injected one, so I don't know if that's still the same for that. But as long as you're precise with the controls and you know what you're doing and treat it with confidence, the bike will always do exactly what you expect it to do. But that can also be something that conversely makes it a bit difficult if you're not confident with it, because all the controls on this bike seem to be operated on small degrees. So throttle openings are very small, acute degrees, and turning in is very delicate inputs, and the brakes you would use with a little bit of caution. And you could theoretically get yourself into a lot of trouble with this bike, but then the same is true of any bike over about 80 bhp. I suppose I should comment on the feel of the linked brakes, and I must say that I don't mind them, not at all. Not for road riding. I've never taken one of these on the track, but on the road they're easy, and they limit the dive from front brakes. It sort of settles in. It makes the rear brake very effective for low speed manoeuvring. See, this is all rear brake. And it also gives you a good initial bite. The weight of the bike does become apparent once you start to do heavy braking. There's a good initial bite, and then it takes a little bit of time for the extra power to develop, but you never have to put on an enormous amount of pressure to get the braking you need. I suppose if you're not careful, it could be easier to lock up the rear if you're using both rear and front brake pedals at the same time, if it was a bit damp or you were being a bit cack-handed, but it's not something that I've ever experienced. In terms of fueling of the engine, like I said before, it's extremely smooth. The engine generally has a lot of power absolutely everywhere in the rev range, and it's extremely linear, which makes it quite easy to use, if perhaps a little bit unexciting. There is perhaps a small hole between 2,000 and 3,000 revs, but unless you're in town you won't really be using that portion of the rev range very much. It seems happiest above 3, and it will pull very happily anywhere between 3 and the red line. The power builds continuously until the red line at about 11,000, but it never feels like it's going to run away from you. It's just one of those engines where whatever power you ask of it above 3,000, it feels like it has enough. It's always enough, never too much, which is good and bad in equal measure, depending on what you look to get from the bike. In town, one of the issues I've found, although it's not a massive issue, it's just something to be aware of, is it reaches the temperature where the fan cuts in extremely quickly, and I've had this from a few other bikes. I think it's something that is common to all of these, but I've never experienced that the temperature gauge goes over where it should be, but it is always a bit concerning when you've been sitting for 1 or 2 minutes or even less and the fan cuts in anyway. But as you can see, bumbling around town, there's not much traffic, and it's all very low effort. I'm extremely comfortable. It's a very comfortable riding position, or at least it is for a big lad like me. I can imagine that it's quite a stretch to the bars for people that aren't as tall as me, but I quite like it. It's a sporting position, but it's a very comfortable sporting position. You can keep the position for a long time without any major discomfort, because the legs aren't very cramped. They're definitely, like I said before, it's definitely a sporting position, and there is some weight on the wrists and you are folded up somewhat, but I find it very comfortable, especially if you're touring. Usually you'd use this bike to tour on the motorway or on the dual carriageway, and you'd have a bit of wind to keep the pressure off your wrists. You can always stretch your legs a little bit, but it's absolutely nothing in comparison to the torture that is a more focused sports bike. You can hear that the fan has cut in already, just going this speed. Although, in this bike's defence, today is an absolute scorcher. It's easily above 30 degrees. I had to wait till the evening to do this because I don't think I would have survived a longer ride in the middle of the day. And I like to ride around when there's not much traffic and not much bike traffic. One thing you do get from the fact that this was, in its time, a very expensive bike and a flagship for Honda is very much a feeling of quality. I mean, this example I bought very locally for about £1,500, and it's been abused. It's not been looked after at all. It's fallen over a couple of times, and it's got a couple of scratches, but it feels tight as a drum to ride, and there's not a spot of rust on the thing. Which I don't think you could say for a lot of other bikes of this time by other manufacturers, or even by Honda themselves. Alright, let's get on to the motorway and sort of show where this is really at home. God, it absolutely laps up those kind of corners. Absolutely loves them. So, when you're on the motorway, about 70 miles an hour is about just over 4 grand on the tacho, so it's extremely relaxed, and it's in a place where you have enough power to stick it in top gear and easily be able to overtake people. Let's demonstrate that. Nice and easy. That was from 60 on, so you're still in a good place. Anything above 3, you have more than ample power available to do leisurely overtakes. There's not much vibing through the bars. It's a rigid mount to the frame, this engine, but there is an extra balancing shaft in the engine that basically eliminates most vibrations. So when you're at motorway cruising speed, you don't get many vibes through the bars, and you don't get that sort of fatigue that you get from other rougher bikes at this sort of speed. The fairing is massive. I believe it was designed to be aerodynamically efficient, but one of the other things that gives you is excellent weather protection. In pretty much all weathers, this is a lovely bike to ride. I could ride in a reasonable period of rain, just not wearing my waterproofs, and be pretty dry for probably up to about 20 minutes to half an hour, which I can't say of a lot of other bikes. Alright, let's turn around. I mean, even changing down there is just really nice. Very minimal effort, although it's very easy to overdo the blips on the downshift because you need not very much throttle to get it right. But when you do, it's very smooth. But yeah, the weather protection. And I did a long ride down to Bournemouth on this, not long after I got it, which is probably about 2 hours from me. And it was in rain the entire time, and I was pretty comfortable. Obviously I was wearing my waterproofs, but I've had much worse rides in the rain. And it feels quite sure-footed in the rain, which is nice. It doesn't feel squirrely or touchy. So as we get onto the, as we turn around on the motorway here, and we get on to the slip road, I'll give it a little bit of power so that you guys can see what sort of acceleration is available. Because in terms of headline figures, these days 135 horsepower isn't much to write home about. You've got 600s putting out about 120 horsepower on paper, so it doesn't sound very impressive. But there's a lot of torque with this engine, and it's available quite early. So if you put the beans on, it goes very quickly. I mean, that was, I don't even think I went to the red line there, but I was up to 100 incredibly quickly and very easily and very stably as well. If you keep it pinned through first gear, the front will come up, but it comes up very smoothly, and the gearbox on this bike is an absolute sweetheart. I don't think I've ever hit a false neutral or any kind of massive clunk. Basically it does absolutely anything you want it to. Clutchless upshifts are fine, using the clutch is also fine. I've not felt it be recalcitrant to go into any gears. I've not had any issues where the back locks up. It feels quite forgiving in that sense, and there's a lot of grip. Fuel range is pretty good actually. It's quite a large tank. It's about £25 to fill up in today's money in the UK, and that will get you probably about 170 to 180 miles out of that tank. That's until you've been riding a couple of, 10-15 miles into the light on the fuel gauge. I've never tested how far the reserve goes, but I'd say 180 to 170 is a decent range on a bike like this. It's nice to be able to hit over 200 when you're touring, but 180 isn't bad. So that covers us on the motorway. What's it like to ride when things get a little bit tighter and a little bit twistier? And this is probably where the bike is not at its absolute best. It is agile and it is easy to ride, but it does weigh 250 kilograms and it does feel it. Let's just get over this guy. So easy. Lovely. But yeah, if you've got smooth A roads and you have long undulating corners, it's good. It loves those kind of corners. But when things get a little bit nadgery, when things get a little bit tight, that's when the weight begins to show itself. It takes a little time to settle when you transition from right to left, and you need to set yourself up through the corners. You can change a line, but not anywhere near as easily as you would on something lighter. And your cornering speeds are going to generally be a little lower than they would be on a lighter bike. Especially when you take into consideration with this bike that there's not an enormous amount of ground clearance. It's not terrible, but you will be grinding out the centre stand at some point, and possibly the exhaust if you go too far. But I think if you're buying one of these, you're doing it with the knowledge, even with just the way it looks and the fact that it's so long and it's a very large, physically a very large motorcycle. You're not going to buy it if you want a weekend hooner. It's not designed for that, and it's not really marketed to that kind of person. If we're just cruising through B roads, like we are now, it's very nice. When you're going sort of 5 out of 10, 6 out of 10 on these kind of roads, it's lovely, because it does just tip into corners and it will hold itself. This particular one has got a strange front end. It could be because I've got a top box, and I have read that they are a bit squirrely with the top box, but going down through about 40 miles an hour, I get an oscillation through the handlebars when I let go that would threaten to develop into a tank slapper if I let it. Let's show a demonstration. See that? That could be a combination of a couple of things. Could be that the fact I've got a top box on at the moment, which apparently can cause issues, and also it's got an incredibly cheap Maxxis front tyre on it at the moment, which I think might not be weighted correctly. And that's just what came with the bike when I bought it, so I will change that in time. But if you keep tight control of it, I don't feel any problems. Although you can feel in very low speed corners that it feels like the front is not as stable as it could be. But above 40 miles per hour, it's not a problem. So as we head through this village here, when we get to the other side, there's my usual little test route where I'd give things a little hoon and spaff into the corners, and I'll do a little bit of that. But as you'll see, I don't feel as comfortable on this going as fast as I might on other bikes of this type. So although I'm not overly complimentary on this bike's high-speed handling, because the engine is so relaxed but powerful, and because everything is quite laid back and minimal in the amount of inputs you need to do, you often find that you're going actually a lot faster than you think you're going. So you will be able to keep up with people if they're not really going 100% on the machine, and you will always have the amount of power you need, but it never feels very fast, which on the road I think can sometimes be a problem. So let's give this a go. So we'll set it up for the corner, and round we go. Power up, easily up to 80. Then we've got a lot of weight to slow down before the next corner. We can always leave it in one gear and just go. But as I go through the bumpier corners, I can feel the mass, and there's just a slight delay in the suspension action as it tries to deal with that mass. But if you give yourself plenty of time to set up, it will go into the corners nicely. So that probably didn't look particularly fast and didn't feel outrageously fast, but I think you find if you compare it to other videos I've done where it looks like I'm doing a lot more work, the actual speeds being achieved there were fairly comparable. But it doesn't feel particularly good for me to ride it like that. It's not something that the bike encourages, and it's all part of the character. It's kind of why I've kept the standard pipes on it, actually, because somehow that sort of smooth, almost electric whine that it has as you go up through the gears, and the real smoothness of the delivery, it sort of feels classy in a way, if any motorcycle can be classy. And I do have a 4-into-1 Yoshimura system sitting in the garage that I've had sitting there for about 2 or 3 months that I got off eBay, and I've been procrastinating on getting it fitted for 2 reasons really. There's a lot of fairings and fasteners to take off, and I think it's got side mounted rads. I don't think I would have to take them off, but I might have to for access, and that might be a pain in the arse. But also I'm not sure I particularly would like this bike to be loud. And weirdly, despite the fact that they're massive cannons, I quite like the look of the standard exhausts as well. Oh blimey, it is a hot day. One thing I should add about the town riding on this bike is not only does it heat up and the fan kick in very quickly, it also kicks out a lot of heat from the side mounted radiators onto your legs, so you can enjoy that. It's nice on a winter's day, but on a summer's day like today, it's all a bit much. So I think I've spoken fairly at length about the feel and the character of this bike, and how it's quite friendly, pretty grown up. It moves well and has a lot of power, but doesn't like particularly to be hustled too quickly in too tight a space. Oh blimey, that looks lovely. So I think I'll start to sum up the bike. Let's start with the highlights. The build quality is definitely one of them. Everything shines up really nicely, even for a bike of this age. Everything feels very well screwed together. There's very minimal problems in terms of reliability. In fact, this is one of the most reliable bikes you could buy. It always comes very high up on the ownership polls and surveys in terms of reliability. I believe it's beaten out in terms of rating by the Honda SP1 and SP2. I think they're probably, I think I read somewhere that they are the most reliable bike you can own, but this always comes pretty high on the list too. Everything is incredibly usable. That's another highlight. Take the dash for instance. Everything is incredibly readable. There's a lot of numbers on here, including 200 mile an hour, which you won't get to. Bloody hell. There's always... I got told once, where you see one deer, you're likely to see another, so we'll keep the speed down for a little bit. But yes, getting back to the clocks. Everything is incredibly readable. You've got fuel gauge, you've got temperature, you've got a clock, you have trip meter, you have speedo, you have rev counter, you have all the idiot lights you would normally have. And one thing I do very much like, you have a side stand light. If you look back to the beginning of this video, you might see that that lit up when the side stand was down. It's a small feature, but one I do very much like. The headlights are incredibly good. It's a massive stacked headlight up front, and both in dipped beam and full beam you have a massive spread. So if you're riding at night, if you're touring, or you're just coming home on country roads, you have incredibly useful headlights. That's another big highlight for me. The engine is definitely a centerpiece highlight. It's just one of the most usable engines I've ever ridden. It always has the power you need. another highlight is value for money. You get an enormous amount of bike for the money, because these are old and the examples you can find are plentiful. You can get them for a very low price. I got this for £1,500 just because it came up very locally to me. And there aren't many bikes, especially with this kind of reliability and build quality that you can get for that money, that you would get quite as much use out of. So we've covered the highlights now. What about the drawbacks to this bike? Well, there are a few, not many. The first one that I will cover is the fuel economy is not great. I guess it's probably fairly normal for this era of bike, but it's about 35 miles per gallon, give or take, depending on how much you're twisting your wrist. And so, although the range on the tank is good, that's mainly because it's a big tank, not because it's a particularly efficient engine. Another low light, as I mentioned before, is that it doesn't particularly make a good track bike or a good weekend hooner. Obviously you could take this on the track and it would do okay, but you would have issues with ground clearance. If you're hooning on the weekend with your mates, it'll do fine. You'd have a better time and a more fun time keeping up on a lighter, smaller bike than you will on this one. There's another low light is just the usual 90s Honda motorbike reliability bullshit. The very small niggles of cam chain tensioners. They will go at about this mileage, about 20,000 miles probably. And the regulator rectifiers are liable to fail. They're very small points, but something to be aware of. Another low light is servicing is relatively cheap until it comes to servicing or changing the linked brakes. They're very complicated and they're a bastard to bleed, and if you're replacing if the rubber hoses start to degrade and you want to put steel braided lines on or just replace them, that is time consuming and difficult. So although in use I quite like them, I am dreading the day where I have to overhaul them. At the moment they're still pretty good, so I'm happy with that. The final low light, as I've just probably done myself right now, is that it will eat through chains and tyres very quickly. It's a big bike, there's a lot of power, and if you use it, you will pay for it. The rear tyre will go in probably 2,500, 3,000 miles. The chain won't last very long either. In fact, I'm on the very last legs for this chain, so I haven't helped myself very much with this video. Now let's talk about this bike and its general position in the used marketplace. Obviously you can't buy them new anymore. The prices for these range between about £1,500 at the bottom level to about £3,500 for the later models with fuel injection and the digital clocks. You will get some dreamers advertising for over £5,000 for like a really clean model, but you should never have to pay more than £3,500 for these. The good news is that there's a lot of examples on the used market, and because they're so well put together, and it's the kind of bike that usually an older or a more mature biker would buy, there's a lot of good examples out there. And you can take your pick of the bunch, basically. You don't have to take the first one that comes your way, like me, who's an idiot. There's not many reliability issues that you're going to come across, and very few sort of terminal reliability issues, so you can buy with confidence really, and you can trawl the adverts and find the right one for you, a guy that polishes it every weekend and hasn't got enough time or will to ride it anymore, and you can find the one that suits your budget, which is a nice position to be in. In terms of competition for this bike, at the same price you've got basically just the older 90s sort of hyper bikes at the time, maybe a Thunder Ace, a ZZR 11 or 1200, and probably the Thunder Ace is a reasonable comparison. It's got similar power, similar weight. It's a bit more sporty than this, and doesn't feel as plush or as classy. Oh, I keep using that word even though I don't like it. The ZZR is nice, but a lot rougher, and the handling is a lot worse. If you look at it in terms of the bikes that unseated it, the ZX12R and the Hayabusa, they are a bit more expensive. Probably 2,500, 2,000 is where the Hayabusas start, and they go up a bit more. But it's an entirely different kind of bike. It's a lot more uncomfortable, a bit more sporty. The engine is unbelievable. The build quality is nowhere near as good. The ZX12R is a nice bike. That's even more expensive still, probably 2.5 grand at the bottom level, going up to about 3.5, 5 grand for the later models. And that again is a very nice bike, but the engine is not quite as tractable. All the power is a bit further up the rev range. It's a bigger bike physically, and it's a taller bike, so it's not quite as comfortable. The range on the tank isn't anywhere near as good either, but it's another bike worth considering. If you're buying one of these just because it's a legendary bike and you want to have one, then awesome, go for it. I cannot recommend it enough. If you're looking at it as an investment sort of bike because you think it's legendary and it's going to be a classic, I don't think that's going to be the case. These seem to have sort of bottomed out in price, and they did a while ago, and I don't see them moving up in value for a long time because there's still so many examples, decent examples around. They're not scarce yet, so it's not really yet an investment bike, a bike that you would buy and keep for a few years and pitch on to make a bit of money. But if you just want to buy the bike and ride it around and have fun, this is the right one. So let me sum this up. This is a bike that you will buy if you want a bike A, to tour on, B, to just use for your everyday stuff, going to the shops, riding around town, commuting. It'll stand up to weather very well. It will do the odd sort of weekend riding part, but it's not so much a bike that you would buy for track use, or a bike that you would buy to go out every weekend and terrorize the community with riding around on your ear and your arse on fire. It's not really a bike that you would buy for an investment, but it is a bike that you will get incredible value for money on. It's highly reliable. It's very smooth. Some people might accuse it of lacking character because it does everything so well, and yet it never really stands out in one particular category. But paradoxically, I think that actually gives it a very grown-up character of its own that I find incredibly appealing. And it surprised me because I bought one of these because basically they were the granddaddy bike when I first took notice of motorbikes, and when I started riding they were still in production and they still were a very desirable bike to have. And it does live up to every expectation that I had of it, despite the fact that usually the bikes I like the Bandit 1200, like the ZRX 1200, I usually like bikes that are rough and raw and make a lot of noise and have flaws that make them have very immediate character. This bike is just very friendly, and whatever you want to do, you can ride it without having to pay too much attention. And all of this makes it a bike that I'm incredibly happy that I bought, and for the money I think I'll keep this as my forever do everything general day-to-day bike. I mean, usually I have to pay a bit more attention to the mechanical goings on as I do these videos, but I can focus on what I'm saying very easily and just get on and ride with this, which is incredibly refreshing. Basically, the Honda CBR 1100 XX Super Blackbird is a legend, and if you're looking for a bike to do a little bit of everything, I cannot recommend it highly enough. I nice it. That's my my rating. Nice it. Awesome bike. Anyway, usual stream of consciousness rambling from the Lone Trader here. But I'm glad to be back. I hope you've enjoyed this little ride and review. And I'll see you for the next one. Cheers guys, bye.